Yes. Okay. I'm Kathy Richardson, and I am interviewing Allan Wade, who is a family therapist, about the history and evolution of family therapy as a field, a human service field. So thanks for agreeing to be interviewed, Allan.
It's my pleasure.
Good. Okay. So I'm curious. I imagine at some point in the evolution of psychology and psychotherapy, people started thinking differently and started focusing on work with families as units as opposed to individuals. And I'd like to learn more about, you know, when that happened and what kinds of things sort of prompted that. Would you like to talk a bit about that?
Okay, that's a big question. There was a lot going on, I think. But I think a lot of that development is located in the States, rightly or wrongly. But I guess in the late 50s, probably there was a movement on the East Coast. Lyman Wynn, Vivian Rykoff, other people were starting to think about trying to help people diagnosed with schizophrenia by interviewing their families, and thinking about how maybe certain kinds of family interaction resulted in someone acquiring what we call schizophrenia. That was happening on the East Coast of the States, and on the West Coast of the States there was some other developments that for me are more interesting and have been more kind of productive in the family therapy field. One that doesn't get talked about very much was the natural history of an interview project that took place at Berkeley. Essentially, some very wise person found a bunch of money and said to a bunch of people working in the field, people in paralinguistics, psychiatry, anthropology, linguistics, and so on, pulled them in and said, why don't you guys come up with a project, and here's some money and we'll fund your research project. And so they had people from many different disciplines working together. And one of the people there whose interest ended up defining the project was Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. Frieda Fromm-Reichmann was a psychoanalyst, Freudian psychoanalyst, who was known for her intuition, especially as regarding working with people diagnosed with schizophrenia. And she was smart enough to realize that she wasn't just mind reading. When she was working with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, she was picking up on communication, on clues that people were kind of giving in the process of interviews. And so she said, why don't we study communication? Why don't we look at what's going on in communication between people who are diagnosed with mental illnesses, or between people who are and aren't, that kind of thing? Because I want to pay more attention to what maybe I'm noticing. And that would be, so she essentially defined, they all agreed, she defined the topic. Gregory Bateson, who had made a film with a woman called Doris, called the Doris film, was around, and they knew about that film. So they got Bateson to let them use the film. Bateson didn't participate much in the NHI, Natural History of an Interview Project, directly himself, but he lent them the film. And so all of them sat around in group, and they started looking at this film over and over and over again. And so they started noticing particular features, real micro-level aspects of the communication. How hand gestures were related to gaze direction, and how body posture was related to voice intonation, and how when one person, you know, held a gesture and fixed their gaze and raised the intonation, the other person tended to respond and nod. And so they started to see the intersection and the interaction of all these micro-levels of communication. And that really, in the end, it led to the growth of what came to be called the structural view of communication. A good analogy is to think of communication as music. So you have different instruments all playing in a musical score. In an orchestra, in this case though, the instruments would be gestures, eye gaze, you know, body posture, facial expressions, voice intonation, those kinds of things. And they're all operating kind of on different channels, so to speak. And then you have two orchestras at once. You have two people, and there you find that, you know, the oboes from over here interact with the bassoon from over here, and they're connected, and they relate to one another. And in the context of that kind of interaction, silences mean as much as noises in a certain kind of way, and none of the noises are really understandable in isolation. They all relate to the others. So they began to think of communication in a much more systemic way, and began to focus on the importance of micro-level communication. If you read the material from the time, it's fascinating, because Margaret Mead and others were absolutely jacked by what they were seeing. It was really the first time people had looked at film repeatedly, and so they got into a level of detail. And they were shocked by the nuance, the complexity, the patterned nature of such complexity, because we do communication all the time, but we tend to overlook its complexity, I think, because it's so natural and easy for us in some kind of ways. So they got right inside of that, and they looked at it. And that kind of project produced a whole bunch of other thinking and a whole bunch of other projects. It influenced the nature of the Bateson Project and the Mental Research Institute and so forth, which we might talk about in a minute. But it was also connected up to some other work in communication that was happening there around the time, Irving Goffman's work. He was already talking about co-presence. When you're in the presence of another person, it's impossible to not communicate, so to speak. That got taken up later in the family therapy field and the pragmatics of human communication. Harvey Sachs, who was around at the time, and his work became the basis of what is now called conversation analysis and discourse analysis. So it was a really rich climate. And then, as I mentioned, Bateson had put in place with John Weakland and others what came to be called the Bateson Project initially, and that was for the study of communication, again, to study so-called disturbed or schizophrenic communication. So they were also looking at the Doris film and doing other things to try and understand about how people who were struggling were communicating. And they began to move away from the whole idea of individual pathology. So what they began to notice or propose was that problems in living, mental problems, so-called mental disorders and so forth, could be responses to disturbed or intensely difficult communication. Not an individual attribute of the person, but the person's response to very difficult social circumstances. And that, at that time, was a radical shift in focus. That was a real departure from conventional ways of thinking. There had been some other people thinking kind of along those lines. In psychoanalysis, for example, Harry Stack Sullivan had been thinking that personal suffering is intimately linked to social circumstances. It doesn't just sort of come from nowhere. He had done a project around that, and Robin Rutledge knows a lot about that. He might tell you a bit about it. So they began to study that kind of communication, and then they became very interested. John Weakland, Dick Fish, Paul Václavic, Gregory Bateson. I think Virginia Satir was around there at the time. Lynn Hoffman was around. I think Bateson hired her to be the historian of the project. I think Mnuchin was around there, Salvador Mnuchin was around there for a little time. So it's kind of a who's who. Janet Bevan-Bablis was around there for later on, I think. So it was kind of a who's who of communication theory and family systems thinking. And the view that came out of the Mental Research Institute, which they eventually formed, differed really sharply from the view that they had been developing on the East Coast. On the East Coast, they essentially took monadic thinking, still thinking of the individual as ill, and they applied that kind of thinking to the family. So they said, okay, it's not the individual that's ill, it's the family that's ill. And so they had identified psychodynamics in the individual that might have been the source of illness. And then they transferred that thinking to the family and said, okay, now there's family dynamics that are the source of illness. So it was still very much a pathology and a deficit based perspective. And out of that whole way of thinking came quite prescriptive or normalizing modes of family therapy. The idea would be that you would see the family, identify the structural problems, their relationship problems, maybe generations of children are too close to one another, emotionally, or maybe the parents are closer to the children than they are to each other, and that creates, conflict and competition and dyads. And so they had a normalistic view of the family. They were saying, okay, healthy family should look like this. So when they got people who were having struggles, they decided to try to change the family, to make it conform to their models of what a healthy family should be. On the West Coast, the view was very different. Their way of thinking systemically was not to think of the family as a system. That's not, on the East Coast, system meant noun. System meant a family. On the West Coast, systemic meant communication between any people.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't refer just to a family unit, it meant a style of interaction. So they use some of the same vocabulary, family systems, but the thinking around it and the practice around it was very different. They also, someone asked Jay Haley, I think, one time, what was the most important thing that Gregory Bateson did? And he said he got funding for John Weekland and him to go visit Milton Erickson. That was Bateson's biggest contribution. I think that was a bit tongue-in-cheek. But Bateson wasn't so much interested in therapy. He tended to kind of look down upon it as kind of a too narrow a pursuit. He was much more interested in broad evolutionary ideas. But he funded Haley and Weekland to go visit Milton Erickson. And Milton Erickson wasn't a family therapist, but he was a physician who had developed all kinds of ways of stimulating rapid change in really stuck situations. So he was known for his kind of incredible creativity, producing rapid change. So once they had moved away from the view that problems come from psychopathology within individuals and moved to the view that maybe problems come from social interaction, that meant then that you didn't have to just change the individual. You didn't need long-term therapy in order to change something structural or the personality structure or something within the individual. It meant that rapid change was possible. If you could change the pattern of communication around the problem, then change could happen actually quite quickly. And so Erickson's ideas fit with and really propelled the growth of similar methods within the family therapy field. So family therapy became, at that time, quite strategic. And the idea was you could kind of trick people into getting well. If you could manipulate the pattern of communication around a person and get the people to change the pattern of communication, then the problem would spontaneously resolve. You didn't have to tell people what to be like. You simply had to interrupt the solution that they had put in place. And so they had this beautiful idea initially that problems in living maybe come from two sources. This is oversimplified, but one source is if you have a difficulty that is something comparatively minor and you make it a problem into something serious, you can kind of create a pattern where you're making a smaller thing into a really bigger problem, and in the very doing of that create another kind of problem. And the other way in which you could create a problem was by making something really serious, a problem, into something too minor, a difficulty. Either way would produce a problem. And so the role of the therapist became to interrupt the solution that people had put in place to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. If you interrupted that solution, then the problem would resolve. At least that was the idea.
Mm-hmm. I like it. And it doesn't have to take a long time.
No, so rapid change became a possibility, and they started developing methods, techniques of trying to help people change, achieve the changes they wanted much more quickly. You have to remember that in the era of psychoanalysis, people would go into psychoanalysis, and the assessment period would be a year or 2 years. You go to analysis once or twice a week, and it was only after the period of a year that you'd found out kind of what the assessment was. Then the analysis would take much longer. So these guys were helping people achieve a lot of changes in their lives, often very, very quickly, which was a revolutionary idea, kind of at the time. And from there, all kinds of different models of family therapy, I think, have developed. Virginia Satir went off and developed some really creative, interesting work, and Steve DeShazer, was influenced by Milton Erickson through John Weekland and other ways, and went on to develop solution-focused therapy, which he wouldn't talk about as a family therapy, but as solution-focused therapy. And then along came INSU, and they developed their own center, and those kind of methods have also morphed off into different directions. Client-directed therapy. Scott Miller's work comes directly from solution-focused therapy. Other folks became more interested in language and language systems, kind of through the Milan team. Harry Galician, those kinds of folks. So language systems, and that kind of morphed with some other influences into the more postmodern approaches. And so Narrative therapy came initially from that kind of interactional thinking. Michael White's first articles really, double description, were based on Bateson's ideas about negative explanation in cybernetics. And only later did he find the narrative metaphor and begin to describe narrative therapy as though it was unconnected with the family therapy field. And so there were many different offshoots as people brought their own kind of preferences and experiences in. My own experience was to train with the Milan team originally. They came to Vancouver Island, thanks to Rob Rillage. And so we had several congressos here where we got to hang out with those guys for a week at a time and just kind of take it all in and get turned on by just the kind of amazing way they thought. And, you know, we're interviewing people.
Would you describe a little bit about the Milan work and how it evolved? Because I know in the beginning it was a bit different than how where it is today. It's still going on.
Well, they were really intrigued initially by the book called Pragmatics of Human Communication, Pragmatis of a Human Communication, as Jakin would say. And also a lesser known book that I really love called The War with Words by an American psychiatrist called Harley Shands. And he doesn't get nearly the credit he deserves, I don't think. And in their initial book, Paradox and Counter-Paradox, they have a chapter 5, called The Tyranny of Linguistic Conditioning, in which they begin to talk about how language itself forces us to identify problems as somehow properties of individuals. He is depressed. So they began to kind of play with language in different ways. Initially, their idea was to essentially trick the family, so to speak, by using paradoxical methods, prescribing the symptom, you know, introducing some shocking kind of new idea or information into the system as a way of kind of dislodging the family from a pattern of interaction and getting them to behave differently. But they also had developed some really interesting ethics around that, which I really loved. For example, they had this process called positive connotation. And what that meant was that you would, you know, interview the family, they would be in a room, and your colleagues might be behind the one-way window. And you would have some description of what the problem was that the family had, but then you would try to interview them in such a way that you came to a systemic understanding of the problem. So one person, let's say, might be diagnosed with depression. You would interview them in such a way that the distress the person was experiencing was linked up with and responsive to interactions in the family. And that would give you a new way of understanding what the sadness was, not as an individual depression or pathology, but as an expression of distress, let's say, within the family unit. And then they would find a way of describing that symptom, so to speak, in a positive way, giving it a positive connotation, a positive meaning within the family. So this really appealed to me because it moved directly away from this deficit-based and pathology-based thinking, because once you see sadness as arising from a constellation of relationships and social interactions and being an understandable response to that, the whole notion to describe it, the whole reason to describe it as pathological is gone. And so it just becomes a matter of trying to understand the interaction in a certain kind of a way. And so they began to talk about how, for example, a child being really sad or despairing, you know, might have some relationship to a loss in the family, and the child might be expressing what the parents couldn't and helping the parents deal with the sadness in the family in a different kind of way. So the whole meaning of the child's distress would be changed if they saw it in that way. And that kind of way of thinking really appealed to me, because I'd always been very troubled by the whole notion that just because people are experiencing distress, that means there's something the matter with them. I mean, it doesn't. It's completely illogical, but that's the common way of thinking. So they also developed, they took a lot of responsibility for what they were doing. They would make an agreement with families originally that they would have, say, 10 sessions. And if at the end of the 10 sessions there wasn't improvement, they would say to the family that they as therapists had failed, that they hadn't understood the situation, that they wanted to take a break for several months. The family could come back, but they didn't think it would be useful to carry on if they were continuing to be unhelpful. I also like that a lot, because that was the opposite of saying, you know, your problem is way too messy for us. You're way sicker than we thought you could be. You know, you need another 5 or 6 mental health professionals, you know, in your life. It was the opposite of that. They were trying to be accountable for the fact that they didn't get anywhere with the family without pathologizing the family. And I also found that really refreshing. Plus, they just had ways of reframing, it was called at the time, coming up with new understandings of what was going on in people's lives that were often just shocking and fun and interesting, things that you wouldn't think of at all. They were fantastic for shaking up. And they also had they had this attitude that they called irreverence. You know, they were very much you know, they took the position that you could date a model and a theory, but you shouldn't marry it. And so you should, you know, practice methods and so on and so forth, but always keep in mind that your preferred method or theory could be incredibly unhelpful or nonsense, and that you needed to kind of be irreverent toward the things that you actually like the most, you know, in the field. And I think that's a beautiful idea as well, because it's when we get stuck in our kind of favorite ideas or favorite theories about families that we often, then we stop being helpful to them. So they had built into their model that you should always question. And they also had unique ways of using the reflecting team. That is, well, it wasn't called a reflecting team then. It was just called what was called the team behind the window. They had this idea that when the therapist came out and interviewed the family, the therapist kind of like became part of the family in a way, and became sort of infected by the family. And so you see, they had some quite uncomplimentary ideas still, right? And so then the therapist would come back at the break and go behind the window, and then the job of the team was to kind of cure the therapist, right? And give the therapist a new idea to take back into the session. And they had some interesting ways of interacting in the sessions. And within the team, they had rules that you could go around and hypothesize, that is to put out an idea, but no one could disagree with anyone else's idea. No one could agree with anyone else's idea. You could pass, but that was it. You just fed ideas into the conversation. And eventually, people's comments would begin to kind of coalesce around certain ideas more than others, and those ideas would become part of your intervention with the family. So they took out the competition for people to be right or wrong. And I think that also created room for all kinds of really creative thinking, I think. Then their ideas got taken up around how to use teams, got taken up by Tom Anderson, and who then changed and refined that practice in a different kind of way based on a different culture, I think, in part. And the narrative folks and the solution-focused folks, they all developed those teams in very different kinds of ways.
So I don't want to make a big leap across time, but if you were to talk a little bit about where response-based practice fits in and how that was related to the original kind of Milan or systemic thinking, in terms of families, what might you say about that?
I would say that part of the influences or the ideas behind what I call response-based ideas now I don't actually probably know about. In that so many of the influences that inform ideas that you come across, that you read about or that you have direct experience of, so many of the ideas and the linkages kind of get lost in a way. But I think the focus on social interaction and my experience of doing microanalysis during my PhD for 8 or 9 years, for me, gave me a real fascination with the tiny little particulars, you know, the small ways in which people interact, and the significance of small actions to social interaction. Even in everyday social interaction, a small, you know, an upturned eyebrow, an ironic grin, a barely discernible greeting, things like that have huge social significance. And when it comes to violence, circumstances where there's danger, risk, people have to be so mindful of how they conduct themselves. Those small things take on probably an added significance. And so when I began working with people who had been subjected to violence of different kinds, I began to focus more and more, trying to think systemically, but also focusing on the details of social interaction. And at the time, I was getting very interested in narrative ideas, and I was getting very interested in solution-focused ideas. with my Milan systemic family therapy training background. And I was also getting in touch with the feminist critique of family therapy. And as you know, the Milan guys and many other family therapists did not like to talk about power. They didn't like to talk about violence. They would pretend that power was a sort of an arbitrary construction and didn't really kind of exist. And so there was a very powerful, important feminist critique of family therapy. And that was, for me, a very important part of what pulled me more and more into trying to understand feminist thinking and feminist analysis. So Michelle Bograd and Olga Silverstein and Imelda McCarthy and Monica McGoldrick and you know, people like that were really huge. And for me, so I was trying to think in more critically informed ways and still focusing on the micro details of interaction in context. What that meant for me was when I was hearing about violence, for example, I started to get interested in how people, what the interaction was. That was kind of my focus. And so when you look at what one person does to another, but then you go beyond that and see how the other person responds, that's more of an interactional view, how the other person responds to that, without seeing it as mutual. One person's violating another and the other is responding and resisting in some way. Then for me, how I began to think about doing therapy kind of had to change. Initially, I kind of fell in love with narrative ideas for a period of time because, you know, Michael White and others were talking about power. They had brought in Foucault into the picture, and that was a whole other really rich source of ideas. And they were talking about power and violence and oppression, and I found that really compelling and interesting. And the work was incredibly creative. And at the same time, they had this focus on, at the time, what they called externalizing the effects of violence and oppression. But if you look at how people resist, you know, resistance is a response to violence. It's not an effect of violence. So I began to kind of have some trouble with this practice of externalizing effects because I began to see that that language of effects is itself a powerful political discourse. And so I began to try to interview differently and started asking people about how they'd responded to particular things, not how they were affected by them. And that just kind of propelled a bigger and bigger and bigger shift in practice. And so I was talking by that time I met Linda Coates, and Linda and I shared a fascination with language, and she was doing critical analysis of violence and oppression. It was so interesting, making the distinction between mutual and unilateral acts. And so I was able to have conversations with Linda regularly. And she's one of those people, you know, she's just constantly sharpened my critical lenses all the time, and we continue to work together and have fun that way. And I was also working with Nick Todd, and Nick's a really brilliant kind of creative thinker, and we had many conversations about understanding resistance and what that meant for how you interviewed people, and we were very interested in the language of colonialism, and then our critique of colonial discourse led further more and more into a critique of psychotherapy discourse and a critique of psychiatric discourse and a critique of all those discourses actually in courts and child protection settings that are related to violence in one way, shape, or form. So we began to develop a whole comprehensive program of research on language and violence that has been from the beginning actually integrated with the clinical practice. So solution-focused ideas came into it for me a little bit later. I'd found that asking some solution-focused questions at the beginning and at the end of sessions, you know, it kind of framed the sessions in a really lovely way that gave them direction. You know, it acknowledged that people were there for a purpose, that they had goals, and then you learn what people wanted, and so although you might talk about adverse events, so-called problems in the middle of the interview and how people had responded to those, you then would come around again to the person's, you know, preferred future, their goals, what they wanted to have happen. So I found the solution-focused questions for me kind of contained the interview in a certain kind of way, but in the middle of that you could talk about adversity and how people had responded to and resisted adversity. And then also at that time, because we were getting into talking about resistance to oppression, often resistance by women to violence by men, not only that, but by Indigenous people to violence in the prison camps that we euphemistically call residential schools and other things like that, that I began also to try and find literature that was really specifically about how people responded to and resisted oppression. And at that time there was very little in the psychotherapy field. So for me, I began reading outside the psychotherapy field, in fiction and you know, in poetry and in ethnography and in history and in other places, and in the accounts of political dissidents, because then you would find really rich and detailed accounts of resistance. And their whole way of talking about violence and victims and how victims responded was completely different than what was happening within the field of the helping professions. So that was a really, continues to be a really rich kind of source of ideas, so to speak, or perspectives.
So if we look at family therapy today, what can families hope for in terms of good practice? What is available to them now? Because it seems like we're going back towards an individualistic orientation.
Yeah, I'm really worried about, on the one hand, we're getting lots more focus on what's called trauma-informed practice. But there are, I think, a number of really serious issues within the field of trauma-informed practice. It's being defined essentially through a DSM lens, and through the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think is problematic. We're talking about trauma, not about violence. So that's an issue because we're focusing again on the interior of the victim rather than on the social context of the problem. So instead of trying to address violence, we're trying to work on victims. And not that we don't need to be doing things to support and help and so-called treat victims, but we can do that in a framework that is fundamentally about aligning with their already existing resistance to violence. Right? Those things can work together. Yeah, so that worries me a bit. And also, I think family therapy, or systemic thinking generally, seems to be kind of on the decline. We're not getting so much of that. In master's level training, so thinking about the importance of relationships and the connection between individual experience and important relationships with one another, with the land, with ecology, that kind of way of thinking seems to be under pressure. In the program that we do, we're trying to kind of continue to try to bring that back and to expose the students as much as possible to systemic thinking, family therapy thinking. And I think response-based practice is fundamentally a family therapy approach, actually. So, but I think also, you know, what they're doing in solution-focused therapy now is deceptively radical. So what I think families can hope for is that people pay attention to what they really want and don't decide for them what they want, but try to learn from people what their preferred future is, what it is that they really want to have happen in their lives. Pay attention to that and be guided by that. And there are lots of really creative, interesting approaches. The client-directed, outcome-informed approach, you know, Miller and Hubble's work is really interesting in that way. Solution-focused work is fascinating in that way. Narrative therapy is now becoming, for me, much more response-based, and still has that central part where there's a focus on trying to address oppression and violence and so forth, which is, I think, very important. And also we're seeing now, I think, further attacks on maybe a further diminishment of what we might call feminist-informed practice. And that's part of that is coming from the trauma field itself. So we're now talking about trauma rather than talking about violence against women, right? So it kind of marginalizes all those discourses and that history of activism, and it elevates people who are kind of technocrats, you know, let's wave your eyes in a particular way. It elevates technical approaches to working on the psychology of the victim and subordinates the activist work that people in the field who know a lot have been doing all the way along. And that really concerns me, so it's kind of creating, I think, more classism within the field. That's a big issue for me. But lately I've been more interested in trying to understand some of the more historical say lines of thought and activism that I think have a great deal to offer in terms of understanding working with people who've been subjected to violence. Frantz Fanon's work, for example, the whole history of post-colonial activism in the Caribbean and the Harlem Renaissance, the connection of that activism with developments of in institutional psychiatry in France, the whole kind of resistance to pathologizing and alienating of people who are experiencing distress. A lot of that came up out of the Second World War, and that whole history that's kind of typified by Fanon in a way, and by François Tosquel and Jean Houry and people like that. That whole kind of history of trying to respond to oppressed people in a very humanizing way has been completely relegated. You know, it's been completely ignored by North American psychiatry, which is actually in a very contemptuous way. But I think there's a tremendous amount of richness there. You know, if we look very carefully at how Fanon, for example, was trying to work with people who had been violated, who'd been tortured in the Algerian liberation struggle and in other contexts, it seems, what I've been able to learn about it, really beautiful work. And so it isn't the case that we've just started, you know, responding to people who've been oppressed since we developed the notion of PTSD. I mean, that's just flat out false. And Fanon was a systemic thinker. He talked about sociogenesis, not psychogenesis of problems, sociogenesis. Problems came from context, and from adversity, and from racism, and, you know, different forms of violence. And so he was a very systemic sociological thinker. So it isn't the case that systemic thinking just began in the States, for example, in the East and the West Coast, as I described initially. There's all kinds of really important underpinnings to that, backdrop to that maybe wasn't even recognized, but I think is really basic to it. And you found that in the writing of you know, Zora Neale Hurston and Claude McKay and Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, and, you know, those people who were writing in very systemic interactional terms about oppression, about the experience, and they are expressing resistance to that. So that whole history of activism, if I can put it that way, I think is relevant to what we're trying to do today, and it's really worth looking carefully at.
Well, thank you. And I'm wondering if we could just get Erica and the camera crew up to focus on some of the family therapy photos you have here, and you could talk about them a bit.
So over on the right, over here, we see Gianfranco Cecchini, and one of the original 4 Milan team, and just above and to the left of Gianfranco is Luigi Boscolo. And these guys, I think, are just incredibly important to family therapy history. Gianfranco died a few years ago. He was struck by a car trying to help a motorist on the side of the road. And Luigi is still with us, and I think his health is failing, but he's still working. Below Luigi is Lynn Hoffman, and Lynn visited Vancouver Island also a couple of times and has been a really great teacher. She's published a lot of great stuff on family therapy, including co-authored probably the best book on the Milan team. The Milan guys didn't like to write very much, so other people wanted to write about them, and so Lynn Hoffman. And Peggy Pan wrote a book with Luigi and Gianfranco. And then we have Charles Waldegrave and Kiwi and Flora. They're the Just Therapy team. And I think Flora has passed on. Not positive about that, actually, but Kiwi and Charles are still with us and working in Lower Hutt, New Zealand, I think. You would know more about that than me, Kathy, I think. But they brought a whole culturally informed kind of lens to family therapy practice and changed the way they operated the whole center down at Lower Head and Hutt, and they're all about, you know, cultural accountability and trying to work together in non-oppressive ways. And they've been, I think, a really fantastic influence in the family therapy field, wouldn't you say? And probably a really underappreciated one, I would think. And just above them to the left is Michael White in an airplane with some shades, looking very, you know, I don't know, looking very what?
Carefree.
Carefree. He's looking very carefree. So he also was, and who, you know, Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg and people like that are missing from my wall, but we'll have to get them up there. And Robin Rutledge. So
Yeah, and it's quite striking to me that a number of these great teachers have passed away just in the last few years, because it's a real...
I recently rediscovered some of his early work, you know, Family Kaleidoscope and Families of the Slums, and it's just fantastic. He was talking about oppression, violence and oppression in a very systemic kind of way. So there's tons there that's, I think, very useful for the family therapy field, and we can kind of be picked up again, you know? So yeah, these guys are passing on, and with them is going a whole lot of systemic thinking and a whole lot of influence. So I think we have to do some things to keep that going, you know, to keep that alive, and so that the younger people coming into our field can really get some of that.
So who in your family most knows about the contribution that you've made over the years to family therapy and knowledge about working with families?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Using
yeah, systemic family therapy question. Yeah. Oh God. Well, that's an interesting. I don't know. I'll say. Who would I say? I'll say Kathy. I'll say my partner Kathy. Although I don't think I've convinced her to read anything that I've ever written. Right?
Maybe she'll watch the videotape.
And my kids are completely contemptuous of the kind of work I do. They go, "Oh yeah, you know, anyone can sit around all day and ask people, how do you feel?"
Hey, it's how did you do that?
I'm kind of, I'm kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of family therapy in my family. Anyway.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being interviewed on this tape.
Oh, good luck with your...
Really important history.
I think so, yeah, it is important. So, no, good luck with your course, and thanks for asking.
Thank you.